Hey, good Wednesday morning, everybody. BAM weather meteorologist Brett Waltz here, giving you a forecast update as we go throughout November and the winter season. This is something we will continue to do, kind of these winter weather Wednesday updates where we talk about the forecast signal, the analogs, the latest data as we head into the winter season. So in this update, we will have a latest idea for the month of November, latest analogs for that, and then the latest signals that we are seeing as we head into December, January, and February. Let's start out with November because there are some key trends that we are seeing right now in the pattern to close October going into November that I think could ultimately end up leading to a cooler signal for the eastern part of the country compared to what initial analog and data guidance would have indicated. We're going to start here. This is a look at the height anomaly, so the upper level pattern for years that had weak global winds heading into November. If you've been watching our forecast videos, this is something that we've been talking about at length. The global wind state right now, the sum, the average of all the winds throughout the atmosphere, much weaker than normal. Very common in La Nina years. This year, maybe even more so to the extreme. We've been pretty much negative, weaker than normal global winds since February outside of just a couple of days here and there. So it's been a very consistent signal. And if you look at the forecast over the next 2 weeks, there's really no sign that that's going to change. We're down below 2.5 standard deviations below normal right now, and overall forecasting the global winds to stay weaker than normal. If you roll that in again into November, one key thing stands out to me here, and that's the high latitude blocking, the warmth up here near Greenland and the Hudson Bay. Years that have weak global winds heading into November, especially ones that were stronger with the weak global winds, tend to have high latitude blocking and warmth up here in the high latitudes, which can allow for cooler shots of air down into the United States. That's really key because, if you just went back and looked at each individual La Nina year, when you average it all out, they tend to be a little bit warmer in the eastern part of the country, which has been the idea. However, with this continued negative tendency of the global winds, along with a couple of other factors that we're going to talk about here in a moment, I would say that the trend is cooler for the eastern United States heading into November right now. If we take a look at overall analogs, I went through here and I looked at the global wind state. I looked at what's going on in the Indian Ocean. I looked at the QBO, or the quasi-biennial oscillation. It's a measure of the stratospheric winds over the equator. It can help determine what the polar vortex is going to do. And then, of course, our La Nina state as well, tropical forcing. You combine all that together, here were the years that showed up the most frequently: 2021, 2017, 2010, 08, and 05. And what you'll notice with these years, again, is the high latitude blocking, warmth and higher pressure developing here over Greenland into the Arctic, which can allow for colder shots of air down into the eastern United States. Now, the question is, how intense are these cold shots? Are we talking notable blasts of cold air? Are we talking ups and downs that averages out slightly cooler than normal? How cold will it actually be based off of this signal? For that, I look into the North Pacific. If we take a look at the North Pacific, one thing that I notice here, cooler than normal air, a trough here over Alaska, that can still allow for some mild flow of air into the western and central part of the country. Until I see a more consistent negative EPO signal or ridge over Alaska, it's going to be difficult to convince me on notable consistent cold. Can we get that at times? Yes. In fact, I think that there could be a time in early November where we do have a negative EPO and we could get stronger shots of cold air. But I'm skeptical that that stays around the entirety of the month. In fact, I've got data support for this as well. If we take a look at the latest European seasonal model, it matches that analog idea very well. High latitude blocking, a ridge of high pressure here over the Arctic and Greenland, can allow for the colder shots of air east. Some warmth here across the western and the southwestern part of the country, but your ridge of high pressure more so over the Aleutians rather than right over Alaska. Matches up very similarly to what this analog would show. Now, of course, the data, it's always too warm. It doesn't show the troughs and the cooler air very well, but the general takeaway is what I'm looking at here. When you combine all that and actually look at the surface temperatures, here's a look at those 5 years. What this would indicate: cooler than normal temperatures for the eastern third of the country in here, warmer than normal air the western and the central part of the United States. Could this trend a little bit cooler? It's not out of the question. I think it really depends on how long the bigger shot of cold air can happen or linger around in early November. Something to keep in mind, but regardless, the tendency is cooler versus our original forecast in the eastern part of the country, and we made that adjustment here. Now, we made that adjustment based off of the signals we're seeing right now. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about November. There tends to be a lot of variability in November. 2024 last year was very warm. 22 was warm. 21 was colder. 17 was colder. 16 was warmer. There's a lot of ups and downs with La Nina years in November, which just naturally leads to lower confidence. But right now, the global wind in the tropical forcing state leans more towards the cooler ones, and so that's where we are going to adjust our forecast to, with warmer than normal air for the central to western United States. In terms of where this puts us with heating demand, it puts us kind of middle of the pack in terms of the last 25 years or so, right at 558. That's about normal, similar to years like 2017 and 2022. In terms of precipitation, with a warmer central to western U.S. and cooler east type of a pattern, it's a dry look. I do think we start to get more traditional La Nina-like forcing, which leads to a northern jet stream across the north-central part of the country, secondary storm track up here through parts of the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes, drier conditions south, which we reflect here in our precipitation outlook for November. Now, in terms of winter, I want to make it very clear. That's the November idea. That doesn't necessarily roll over into December, January, and February. Some of these years will still be very good. There's no doubt about that. But they aren't necessarily perfect into DJF. And I think there's a couple of other ones we want to factor in. And so those are the top November analogs. We're going to look at them for December, January, February, but not necessarily mean that it's just going to be those fives. We need to look at the bigger picture for the seasonal time frame. One thing that we did look at here, and there are some similar years, 21, 17, and 05, for example, negative QBO years, which is the stratospheric wind, combined with a weak La Nina, tend to support a more disrupted polar vortex. And most notably, it tends to send lobes of the polar vortex here over the Hudson Bay, somewhat similar to last year. This would give us a tap to colder air as we go throughout winter. This is really important because if the vortex splits or it's weak and it sends the cold to the other side of the planet, then it doesn't really matter. You need a weak vortex, but you need it to send the cold into the right place. These analogs would suggest that that can happen. That gives us a tap to cold air as we head into winter. You take a look at the upper level pattern with this, a couple of notes. Number one, you have the colder air. This is what we call a positive TNH, a tap to some cooler than normal air, maybe Arctic air at times. However, the negative NAO signal in November does not necessarily carry over into winter. You can see there's not that big high pressure over Greenland for the most part. That can lead to the southeast ridge and some warmer air south and east. That would lead to a big active storm track through the Midwest and the Ohio Valley into parts of the interior northeast, but not necessarily for the East Coast. If we look at the latest Euro seasonal, it matches up very well. It's got some of this ridging in the North Pacific. It doesn't have a big negative NAO. It keeps the lobe of the polar vortex here over the Hudson Bay, which would allow us to tap into some cooler air with warmer air south and southeast. So again, analogs and data talking a little bit. Based off of that analog set that we plotted, combining La Nina in the stratosphere, looking at seasonal data, I don't think that I would touch this idea right now for DJF. This has not been changed much over the past month or so since our preliminary one. I don't think that I would adjust this much right now. I think that this is still probably a very solid idea. Most of the cold air are most consistently in the upper Midwest and northern plains. At times, you can get more widespread shots of cold for the central and eastern U.S., I would say especially around the new year and into early January. Again, global winds in November, this was a big factor. It still is a factor into December, and I will note that if there is a colder risk to the forecast, if our global wind stays extremely negative into December, the lowest 4 years were a little bit more widespread with the colder air in December. If there is a risk to the DJF forecast, I think it's December, and I think it's colder. I think it would be colder through this area in here. Something to keep an eye on, something to watch. If we can keep the global wind state low into December, it could potentially allow for a little more blocking in the North Atlantic and the potential for more widespread cooler than normal temperatures for the eastern part of the country. Something we will need to be keeping a close eye on as we get a little bit closer to mid to late November and into, of course, December. Guys, that's all I have for today's winter weather update. Guys, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Appreciate you watching. Have a great day.